Ladies and gentlemen, your sweet Zionist Prince Tall, the traveling clack, coming to you live from Israel. We got a special little talk here from Ben Shapiro on Jerusalem and Israel. Let's take a look.
Tonight, I want to talk about the importance of Jerusalem, of Yerushalayim. Not merely the city of Jerusalem, Yer HaKodesh, Yer Zahav, the center of the spiritual universe, but the concepts that sprang from Jerusalem and that have shaped the world we all live in, whether we believe in the God of the Bible or whether we don't. The modern world likes to think of itself as rooted in reason, and our pseudo-intellectuals like to think of reason as completely separate from religious principle. Their basic idea seems to be that religion inhibits thought, that religion enshrines the traditional at the cost of the creative, that it disparages science, that it re-enshrines bigotry, as we hear all the time about the Bible and people who believe in the Bible. This has been the lie at the center of nearly every modern revolutionary movement since the French Revolution. That the triumph of religion means a dark age, that abolition of religion means the full flowering of humanity, that destroying Jerusalem will lead to a better world. As we'll discuss in a few minutes, precisely the opposite is true. But to understand just why humanity liberated from religious principle ends in concentration camps, we have to first understand what Jerusalem brought to the world in the first place. In approximately 1313 BCE, according to traditional biblical belief, God spoke to the Jewish people at Mount Sinai, at Har Sinai. He spoke from the smoke and the sound of the shofar, and he declared fundamental truths that are unreachable by reason alone.
I want you guys to think about just one concept as Ben is talking here, which I generally do agree with a lot of Ben's opinions on Judaism. I think something that's maybe not talked about enough, the values of Western civilization, Western democracy, the West, Europe, are literally all values of the East. They're all values of Israel. The entirety of Western civilization, democracy, enlightenment, all of it comes from Israel. Both the Old Testament, the New Testament, the stories and legends of the prophets in Israel, 99% of them take place in this tiny little country known as Israel. Mind you this and remember this as the world demonizes and scrutinizes Israel and makes it harder for Israel to exist and for the Jewish people to rise up, have independence, and have security. Remember that the backs of almost all the civilizations you see in the West today that are the moral arbiters of truth and humanity and ethical practices are based in Israel.
Those fundamental truths were essentially three. First, the Torah claimed that God was one, was unified. Second, the Torah claimed that human beings would be held to a standard of morality. Morality springing from God's will, not from our own ideas of what is moral, and that we have the ability to choose how we act because we are made in God's image. And finally, the Torah claimed that God chose a particular nation with which to show the world's universal values, and that the history of that nation would exemplify the progress of humanity. Let's address each of the Torah's contentions in turn. First, the Torah argues that God is one. Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. This was a radical sea change from the pagan belief systems that preceded the Bible. Those pagan belief systems contended that multiple gods ruled an utterly chaotic universe. Now, this explanation of the universe was both politically advantageous and also explanatory. It was politically advantageous because it allowed pagan cultures to merely integrate new gods into the religious superstructure. Right? If you're the Greeks or you're the Romans, you come along, you find a new god, and suddenly that becomes part of your pantheon. It allows you to absorb other peoples.
Right.
And it was explanatory because it answered the question as to why the world seems so confusing. If the world is a reasonable place, why is everything so chaotic? The Torah rejected all of this. The Torah argued that there is one God. The first of the 10 Commandments was simple and direct. I'm the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. God was the first and the last, the creator. What's more, God's singularity meant that intolerance for untruth had to be pursued. Paganism promoted tolerance and diversity above truth. The Torah argued that truth must triumph, that there is one truth, and that God represents the highest truth. What's more, the Torah argued that God rules over a universe governed by his will, his singular will, a prime mover. A singular God instead of myriad gods, a panoply of gods, would require that logic governs the universe, a predictable set of rules discernible by the human mind. And indeed, that is the precise claim of the Torah. Lo b'shamayim hi, it's not in the heavens. It's here for us to learn and for us to discover. The universe isn't random. The rules are generally understandable. The Bible isn't just a set of stories designed to explain why the rain falls and the sun shines. Instead, the Bible lays forth for the first time an argument for the internal logic of the universe. God created that universe step by step. He governs that universe in a fashion we can investigate. In Bereshit, in Genesis, the patriarch Abraham asks God to abide by his own rules for right and wrong, for example. When God says that he wants to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, Abraham argues with God over right and wrong. He asks God whether collective punishment is appropriate if there are still good people living in the city. And God answers him. God doesn't merely ignore Abraham or silence him. Instead, God engages with man. In a chaotic world with no master moral values, the story of Abraham makes no sense. Now, Judaism doesn't claim that we're capable of understanding all of God's motives or actions. We can't understand all of the rules. In Exodus, Moses specifically asks God to show him his face, and God refuses, saying, "You can't see my face, for no one can see my face and live." This metaphor is God's way of saying that we humans cannot completely understand God. But God does have a standard, even if we can't fully comprehend it. Right?
Which, by the way, is, sorry to interject on Ben Shapiro's wonderful speech, but this is why you guys watch my YouTube channel, right? Faith, the whole concept of faith, what I love about it is it's supposed to be a bit of a struggle. It's not supposed to be perfect. We had all the answers and we knew all the truth. This is a rabbi told me this when I was a kid. You'd lose the point of the religion. There'd be no point in having faith in God. One of the things that binds me as a Jew to Hashem, to God, that makes me a real believer is the fact that I don't have all the answers. I'm in a constant quest of knowledge, wanting to know, and struggling with my belief system. Uncovering and finding new truths and old truths and connecting those pieces and see how that value system fits into my life it's the main idea behind Judaism. It's why I get up and pray and put on my tefillin every day. It's why I consistently keep on the practices my families have carried on for generation to generation, is because of that struggle of faith. I know that nobody in my family, none of my ancestors ever had perfect emunah, perfect belief in God. That's the whole idea, is every time you come back to God, every time you come back to faith, you come back to, who you believe is your God, you are sort of continuing that message, continuing that belief. And speaking of awesome beliefs, do you believe in this channel and do you want to support it? Well, you can buy the Traveling Clap merch on thetravelingclat.com. Put me on your body. That's little old me walking through the desert, walking through Jerusalem. That's one of my logos. Here's another one of my logo. Get a shirt. Get some stickers like what's on my laptop. Come on, ladies and gentlemen. We got Traveling Clap merch galore and a bunch of new designs always. All right, back to the video.
Right, God's answer is that he's going to walk in front of Moses, and Moses will be able to see his back. He'll be able to see the knot of his tefillin in the Talmud. God doesn't randomly change his standards. He is the rock, his ways are perfect, all his ways are just, a faithful God who does no wrong, upright and just is he. The notion of a moral universe is a Judaic creation. It's woven into the name of Israel itself. Yisrael, of course, means struggle with God. And God wants human beings to struggle with him.
There you go.
That is our task on earth.
That's what I just talked about.
To try and understand God's moral standard and then enact it. Second, we know from the Torah that God demands that we act morally, that we have the ability to choose because we're created in God's image and God is inherently creative. Before the Bible, man was cosmic chattel, a speck, brooded about by the forces of the divine. The gods didn't expect much of man beyond simple bribery, every so often burn an animal carcass, and that was pretty much as good as it was going to get. There was no linkage between what we would deem moral behavior and divine expectation. The gods were arbitrary. They were not chained to rules. Human behavior wasn't tied to divine behavior. The Bible offered a different perspective. A singular God meant a singular standard for behavior. Consequences were supposed to be life lessons, meant to teach us to be moral. Sin had consequences, and by the way, does have consequences in the real world. Now, that didn't mean that every sin would be punished with prompt and proportional consequence, because God doesn't play whack-a-mole with human sin. But it does mean that following God's commandments would usually lead to better life results than doing the opposite. Polytheism argued that the gods were holy and thus human beings ought to serve them. Judaism argued that we ought to be holy in imitation of God. And Judaism argued that we had the ability to choose to be holy. Polytheism had little notion of the value of individual human beings. This wasn't true for the rulers in polytheistic cultures who were ranked among the gods themselves. You look back to basically any ancient country, from Egypt to Mesopotamia to Rome. If you look at any of them, the leaders were the people who mattered. They were made in the image of God. Literally, they would say this in all of their writings. Epic heroes of the ancient myths are identified with the gods. Commoners never even appear in the narratives. The Torah fought the notion of human inequality before God tooth and nail. We are all created equal before God in our endowment with a certain level of free will. Perhaps most importantly, the most important sentence in human history was this from Bereshit Aleph Kav Zayin, right? Genesis 1:27, God created man in his image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. Instead of a ruling caste with the power of free will, now all human beings, each and every one of us, was granted the value of choice. God stamped us all, breathed life into all of us, formed us out of the clay, out of the ground. The creation story itself is designed to demonstrate how the first man, Adam, used his innate power of choice wrongly, and we are all Adam's descendants. One of the most moving segments of the Bible takes place just before Cain slays his brother Abel. God sees that Cain is jealous that Abel's offering has already been accepted. And God passionately informs Cain, why are you annoyed? Why has your countenance fallen? Is it not so that if you improve, it will be forgiven you? If you do not improve, however, sin lies at the entrance, and it longs for you, but you can rule over it. There's a constant recurring theme in the Chumash. God lays out the importance of choice, of proper exercise of free will. He says in Dvarim, see, I set before you today life and prosperity, death and destruction. I command you today to love the Lord your God, to walk in obedience to him, to keep his commands, decrees, and laws. And now choose life so that you and your children may live. Because we choose, we are God's partners in creation. We're signatories to a covenant with God.
Correct. This is, by the way, one of the most, I think I may have talked about this in a video recently. There's a misconception that we are the chosen people because God chose us. It's actually, in reality, in Jewish theology, it is believed very much so that God didn't choose us, is that God offered the ability for people around the world to be chosen. Out of the many nations that existed at the time, there were many nations amongst the people. The Israelites were the ones who took God up on the offer. The Israelites are the ones who chose God, rather than God chose the Israelites. There was our offer on the table to be the believers in one God, and the Israelites are the ones who followed in pursuit of that. And so that's actually in our theological, in our worldview, we're not the people that God chose. We're the God that we chose, or God is the deity that we chose as people. It's kind of a hard concept to explain, but yet we aren't the chosen. We are the Am that Bachar, the Am, the nation that chose. So that's a really, really important concept and something I actually really love about Jewish theological theory.
Which we have to play our role and choose to abide by our commitments. And free choice is the central element. When God brought the Jews out of Egypt and stood them before Sinai, he required them to sign on to the program. And they made an affirmative decision to contract with God, and they did so without even waiting to hear the terms. Na'aseh v'nishma, we will do and we will hear. Freely willed action even preceded justification. The third lesson of the Torah is that history progresses. And the Torah uses the people of Israel as an example of that divine presence in history. Now, history in a lot of cultures has no beginning and no end. Greek thought saw the universe as permanent and moving in circular fashion. History would recur, and then it would grow, and then it would decay, and then recur and grow and decay. There could be no vision of a progression in history, an inexorable movement toward a better time or a messianic era. Progress itself was, for many of the ancients, an illusion. Or not even that. It was an idea that had no place in the rational universe. That view of history was not unique to the Greeks. It was true of the ancient Babylonians, Native American cultures, Hinduism, Buddhism. The Bible takes a fundamentally different view. The Bible immediately sets God in the context of a time-bound history. God, of course, exists outside of time, but he's intimately involved in creating progress. The Jewish creation story notes that God intervenes day by day to create new levels of complexity in the material world, and then he rests. When God intervenes in the world, it is to better the lot of mankind or to teach lessons. God inserts himself in history by preserving Noah and his family. He restrains himself from stopping history ever again by destroying his creatures, no matter their choices. God manifests himself to Abraham to send the first monotheist on a journey to a place Abraham doesn't know. And God then makes a covenant with Abraham to build him up into a great and mighty nation connected with a particular parcel of land, Eretz Yisrael.
Absolutely correct. The nation of Israel.
God chooses Abraham. He chooses Isaac. He chooses Jacob. And then he chooses the people of Israel to act as exemplars of morality across history, to spread his word with Moses as his prophet. God says, you are to be holy to me because I, the Lord, am holy, and I have set you apart from the nations to be my own. The story of history is the story of God's romance with his chosen nation, his decision to take that nation out of slavery and bring it forth into freedom, to use that nation as a vehicle for the transmission of his message. God says, has any God ever tried to take for himself one nation out of another nation by signs and by wonders, by war, by a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, or by great and awesome deeds like all the things the Lord your God did for you in Egypt before your very eyes? But, of course, history isn't linear. The plot has twists and turns. The story of humanity is the story of the romance between an honorable God and a straying nation, a nation that knows better but has to learn and relearn to love God once more, and a God who occasionally hides his face but waits patiently for his people to return to him. With each relearning comes progress, a movement toward that historical finish line. We are all part of the great drama of history. History gives us a place. It gives us a rationale. We may live as individuals, but we're part of the tapestry of time, the great chain of history. And even if our thread comes to an inglorious end, God weaves with us. History, in short, can progress. It can progress because God cares about us as individuals and because he's invested in our history. And the Torah argues that the eventual culmination of history will come with a universal recognition of God and his handiwork, with the Jews as the treasured jewel shining forth light from Jerusalem, from this city. These three arguments have created the modern world because God is one. The universe is worth exploring and investigating, and our minds mirror God's to the extent that we can discover many of his laws. In this basic principle lies the root of science. Because God gave us free will and demands of us morality, we have to pursue virtue within the context of freedom. Tyranny is an imposition on our individuality, but libertinism, the perversion of liberty, is a betrayal of our holiness. The notion of ordered liberty began at Sinai. Because God tells us that history progresses and that progress is possible, he demands of us that we pursue it. And because God chooses a people as his example, he tells us we have to understand that progress can be achieved in a number of ways, with respect for those of other nations and cultures, and an understanding that there are certain moral values that stand above all of us. The roots of international order begin with the morally justified nation, now with a cadre of experts who sit atop some sort of international institution and tell us all what to do.
The UN. Fuck the UN.
Now, we are in the process, unfortunately, in the West, of caricaturing the Bible, of mocking it, of forgetting it. The root text of the West is being abandoned in favor of a sort of free-floating rationalism, this idea that we can come up with anything out of our minds. Without the premises of Sinai, that rationalism collapses in on itself like a dying star. After all, what good does reason do in a godless, reasonless, purposeless universe? It's a discussion I've frequently had with Sam Harris, who likes to argue that we can simply use our minds and our reason to suss out everything there is to know about the universe. And I've always said to him, I don't understand how he can claim that there's such a thing as absolute truth outside the context of an absolute. If all we are evolutionarily adaptive creatures, there's nothing there that speaks to the idea of an absolute truth that human beings can grasp. There's what's evolutionarily adaptive and what's evolutionarily not. Rationality without that higher purpose means nothing. What can reason actually accomplish if we aren't so much godly creatures as those evolutionarily adaptive animals, incapable of seeking or understanding any higher truths, truths that actually don't exist in any case? What sort of progress is possible when we don't have any common standards of right and wrong? The only progress possible is utopian world breaking, which we saw in the 20th century, or a regression back to paganism. Again, the 20th century was the story of rationalism without religion, and it ended in gas chambers and gulags. A world liberated from the premises of the Bible built all of that. After all, progress could not be achieved by adherence to the wisdom of tradition, but by breaking eggs to make omelets. Forget particularism, forget nationality, the world said. Instead, universalism had to triumph through universal application of power. Right? One nation or another would dominate all the others. Hundreds of millions of people died for these ideas. Our century is the story of the latter problem, the regression back to paganism. We are reverting to tolerant lies, promoted by self-appointed kings who soar above the restrictions of other human beings. Human beings aren't made in the image of God. Only the experts are made in the image of God. We don't have free will. Only they have free will. There's no such thing as an absolute truth. There is only what the experts tell us. We have returned to an era when gods ruled us from above, not through rules, not through reason, not even through explaining themselves, but through sheer power, when chaos was the order of the day. Now, can we truly argue that we as a society are better off now that we've abandoned Jerusalem? Is our society a society that currently argues in the West that men can be women, that inequality of results automatically means discrimination, that evil terrorist groups and moral armies are engaged in cycles of violence? Is this a truly better or more moral society? The answer, of course, is no. We must return to Jerusalem. We must never forget Jerusalem. For so long as it remains in our hearts, so will the God in whose image we were created. In the words of Isaiah, Ki mitzion tetze Torah u'devar Hashem miYerushalayim, the Torah will come forth from Zion, and the word of God from Yerushalayim. Thank you so much.
I gotta agree with a lot of that stuff. There's nuances in Ben's speech and the things that he believes in that I'll never 100% get behind, but I've been watching Ben Shapiro since I was like 16, 17. And you know, there's a lot of, I'm 28 now, so it's been over 10 years. And, you know, I generally really agree with this idea of not like every human being in the world needs to center Jerusalem around themselves, but getting down to the core and understanding and appreciation of the fact that most of Western civilization, most of you watching at home have been affected by this very land that I'm standing on, inhabited by this very people that are currently inhabiting it. And to be honest, a lot of us have done a shit job protecting the Jews and protecting Israel and the nation of Israel so we can continue on this mission of bettering the world and bringing light to the world. And I think we all need to hold that very dear to our hearts and do a better job, including myself, including the Jewish people. I love you guys very long time. Please do support the channel, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye, clats. If you believe in my content and want to support me, just know your help is needed. There's a bunch of great ways to support me, being PayPal, Buy Me a Coffee, or joining my Patreon community down below. Patreon is the best way to support my channel, and you'll get a bunch of cool perks depending on what tier you join. Another great way to support me is by buying my merchandise on thetravelingclat.com. I regularly drop new merch designs like this beautiful hat, or this amazing shirt, where you can support the channel and get something cool for yourself. I also have an amazing Discord community with people from all over the world. Thank you so much for your support.